Halloween was never a big deal for me. For some, it's an excuse to dress up, eat candy, or try to scare the neighbors. But for me, it was just a day to stay indoors, watch a few scary movies, and enjoy the peace and quiet once the trick-or-treaters were gone. This Halloween was no different, or so I thought. The night started out like any other. I got home late from work, just in time to catch the last wave of kids running door to door, their laughter echoing through the chilly evening air. I didn't put much effort into decorating, just a simple pumpkin on the porch and a bowl of candy for the kids. I wasn't planning to stay up long, just enough to hand out treats and then settle into my usual routine of watching horror movies and relaxing. By around 9 p.m., the flow of trick-or-treaters had slowed to a trickle, and the streets grew quieter. The occasional group of teenagers passed by, laughing and shouting, probably up to no good, but otherwise the night was winding down. I flipped through channels, not paying much attention to the random horror movie playing on the TV, and scrolled through my phone, mindlessly passing the time. Then, there was a knock at the door. It was subtle at first, 3 soft knocks, barely audible over the noise from the TV. I glanced at the clock, 9:30 p.m. Too late for kids to be out trick-or-treating, I thought, but maybe there were some stragglers or teens playing pranks. I got up, candy bowl in hand, and walked to the door. When I opened it, I wasn't met by a group of giggling kids or bored teens. Instead, a single figure stood on my porch. They were wearing a mask, an unnervingly realistic one. It wasn't like the typical plastic masks kids wore on Halloween. This one was different. The features were too lifelike, too human, except for the blank, expressionless stare frozen on the mask's face. The eyes were hidden deep in shadow, and the skin of the mask was pale, almost translucent, like it was crafted to resemble a real face, but with something subtly wrong about it. Too perfect, too smooth. Trick or treat, the figure said in a low, almost mocking tone. There was no excitement in their voice, no cheer or laughter, just those words hanging in the air like a challenge. I chuckled awkwardly, holding out the bowl of candy. "You're a bit late," I said, trying to break the tension. I expected them to reach for the candy, but they didn't. They just stood there, unmoving, the mask's expression locked onto me like it was watching, studying. After a long, uncomfortable silence, the figure tilted their head slightly, as if analyzing me. Then, without a word, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night without looking back. I closed the door, an unsettling feeling creeping over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the interaction was wrong. It wasn't just the mask, it was the way they stood there, not moving, not reacting, just watching. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a weird Halloween prank, but the image of that mask stuck in my mind. Back on the couch, I couldn't focus on the movie anymore. My mind kept replaying the scene at the door, the lifeless eyes hidden in shadow, the eerie silence that followed after they walked away. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Around 11 p.m., I was finally beginning to relax when I heard it again. Knock. 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 This time, the knocking was louder, more deliberate. My heart skipped a beat, and I glanced at the clock again, 11:45 p.m. There was no reason for anyone to be knocking at my door this late. No kids, no pranks. This was something else. I approached the door cautiously, not opening it this time. Instead, I peered through the peephole, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The same figure from earlier was standing there. But now, they weren't alone. 2 more figures stood beside them, all wearing the same disturbingly lifelike masks. They were arranged in a straight line, perfectly still, each one with their head slightly tilted, staring at the door through those blank, soulless eyes. I stepped back, my heart racing. This wasn't a prank. This was something far more sinister. I grabbed my phone, trying to call the local police, but the call didn't go through. My signal was gone. I checked the Wi-Fi out. No service. Panic started to set in. I tried the landline, but it was dead too. Nothing was working. For a few moments, I just stood there, frozen in place, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with thoughts of what was happening, but none of them made sense. Why were they here? What did they want? Then, the knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my body was trembling. I backed away from the door, moving toward the kitchen. The house felt too quiet, like something was waiting, lurking just out of sight. Every little sound, the creak of the floorboards, the faint hum of the refrigerator felt magnified, like the house itself was holding its breath. The phone in my hand buzzed, and I nearly dropped it. It was a text from an unknown number. Look outside. D. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to, but my hands moved on their own, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek out the window. My heart stopped. They were standing in the street now, not just the three from before, but more dozens of them, all wearing those same lifelike masks. They stood in a perfect line, motionless, staring at my house. None of them moved, none of them spoke. They just watched, like they were waiting for something. I stumbled back from the window, my hands shaking. This couldn't be happening. There were too many of them, too organized, too deliberate. This wasn't just a group of kids messing around. This was something far more calculated, something terrifying. The knocking came again, from the back door this time. I spun around, knife in hand now, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. I moved cautiously toward the back of the house, checking the lock on the door, making sure it was secure. It was. But the knocking continued, relentless, like they knew I was inside, knew I was listening, waiting. I backed away, retreating to the living room, but as I moved, I heard something else. A faint, almost imperceptible creak from upstairs. Someone or something was inside. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, listening. My house was old, it made noises all the time. But this was different. This was deliberate. It was the sound of someone moving, someone trying to stay quiet. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I just stood there, gripping the knife, listening to the soft, steady footsteps coming from above. I stood in the dark, trying to control my breathing, trying to make sense of what was happening. The knocking had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it cut through the darkness like a blade. I whipped around, my eyes scanning the room, but I couldn't see anything. Just darkness. Just shadows. The phone buzzed in my hand again. You can't hide. My heart pounded in my chest. I dropped the phone, backing away from it like it was a snake ready to strike. The sound of footsteps upstairs became louder, a steady, deliberate rhythm moving toward the top of the staircase. I could feel the weight of the silence that followed, thick and heavy, pressing down on me. My mind raced, spinning in every direction, trying to figure out what to do. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where would I run to? The house felt small, claustrophobic, as if the walls were closing in. I forced myself to think. I backed into my bedroom, shutting the door and locking it too. My legs felt like jelly, and my body was drained from the adrenaline coursing through me. I could still hear those words from the text echoing in my mind, "You can't hide." All I could do was wait. Wait for the night to pass. Wait for dawn to break. Wait for this nightmare to end. The minutes felt like hours, each one dragging by slower than the last. My mind was a tangled mess of fear and exhaustion. I kept thinking about those footsteps, about the strange, haunting text. I tried to tell myself it was all just some sick joke, that I'd wake up in the morning and laugh at how stupid I was for being so scared. The air was crisp on Halloween night, a biting chill that wrapped around me like a shroud as I navigated the streets. A harvest moon hung high, casting an eerie glow over the neighborhood, and the shadows danced in its light, creating a mesmerizing yet unsettling atmosphere. I had always loved this time of year, the thrill of costumes, candy, and the anticipation of something lurking just beyond the flickering jack-o'-lanterns. The neighborhood was alive with the sounds of laughter and the occasional shriek, children darting from house to house, their costumes a kaleidoscope of color against the darkening sky. As I walked, I couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement mixed with apprehension. I had met Jason online a few weeks prior, and from our very first conversation, he had charmed me with his wit and humor. Our chats flowed easily, filled with laughter and shared interests. We discussed everything from our favorite horror movies to the best candy to hand out on Halloween. I felt a connection with him that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Each text and phone call drew us closer, making the prospect of meeting him in person exhilarating yet daunting. When he invited me to his Halloween party, I felt a flutter of excitement, but it was tinged with caution. I knew better than to dive in without a lifebuoy, so I took the necessary precautions. I shared my plans with a close friend, texting her the address and the time I'd arrive. Just in case I told her, my fingers tapping nervously on the screen. I wanted to be careful, to make sure that someone knew where I was and who I was with. My friend texted back reassuringly, promising to check in on me later that night. I arrived at Jason's house a little after 8, my heart racing in anticipation. Dressed in a vintage witch costume, complete with a flowing cape and a pointed hat, I felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. The exterior of his home was unremarkable, an old 2-story structure that could have blended into the backdrop of any horror film. The porch light flickered ominously, casting erratic shadows that seemed to mock my nervousness. I stood at the door, hesitating for a moment, the chill of the night air settling deeper into my bones. My mind raced with thoughts of the evening ahead. What if he wasn't what he seemed? What if the chemistry we had online didn't translate to the real world? Shaking off my doubts, I rang the doorbell, heart thumping in my chest. After a moment, the door creaked open, and there stood Jason, but something was off. He wore a mask, a grotesque, twisted creation with a wide grin and hollow eyes that stared right through me. I hesitated, a surge of instinct telling me to turn and run, but curiosity and the thrill of the night kept my feet planted. "Welcome to my haunted abode," he cackled, his voice muffled through the mask. "Come on in. Everyone else is already inside." I stepped into the dimly lit entryway, the door shutting behind me with a finality that sent shivers down my spine. The air inside felt stale, tinged with something sweet and sickly, like burnt sugar. "Where is everyone?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Ah, they're just in the back. You know how wild Halloween parties can get," he replied, gesturing toward a hallway that led deeper into the house. I followed, the creaking floorboards echoing beneath my feet as if the house itself were groaning in protest. As I ventured further inside, I noticed the unsettling details. The walls were lined with odd photographs, some depicting smiling faces while others were distorted, twisted into expressions of pain or horror. A feeling of dread settled in my stomach, but I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just the atmosphere of the season. "Let's go to the kitchen," Jason said, his voice dripping with enthusiasm. "I made some special treats." He led me through a doorway into a large kitchen, where dim lights flickered overhead. The countertops were adorned with grotesque, half-eaten snacks and unidentifiable dishes, each one more disturbing than the last. A half-melted witch's brew bubbled in a cauldron, and the scent was nauseating. "Looks great," I forced a smile, but my heart raced as the sense of wrongness deepened. "Where are the other guests?" He leaned closer, the mask shifting slightly as he laughed. "They'll be here soon. They always come late to the best parties." A sudden crash echoed from the hallway, making my heart leap into my throat. I turned to look, but when I glanced back, Jason was no longer smiling. His eyes, dark and empty behind the mask, held a predatory gleam. "I think we should play a little game," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. Before I could react, he lunged at me, his hand grasping my wrist with iron strength. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm away, stumbling backward. "What the hell?" I shouted, backing away, my mind racing. This was not the friendly guy I'd been talking to. This was something else, something terrifying. "Don't be scared. It's just a little fun," he sneered, removing the mask with a swift motion, revealing a face twisted into a maniacal grin. "Let's see how fast you can run." Without thinking, I turned and sprinted for the door. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I dashed down the hallway. The sound of his footsteps echoed behind me, chasing me, taunting me. I reached the front door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the knob. It wouldn't budge. "Where do you think you're going?" he called, his voice cold and mocking. "The party's just getting started." I glanced over my shoulder to see him gaining on me, eyes glinting with manic excitement. In a desperate bid, I darted into a side room, slamming the door behind me. I quickly locked it, my heart racing as I scanned the space. It was a small office cluttered with bizarre artifacts, but I couldn't think about that now. I could hear him on the other side, muttering to himself, sounding both amused and furious. I needed to find another way out. The room had a window, and as I rushed toward it, I could feel the oppressive atmosphere closing in. With trembling hands, I pried open the window and looked down. It was a steep drop, but there was no other choice. I took a deep breath and clambered onto the sill, praying the ground would break my fall. Just as I was about to jump, I heard him burst into the room, a wild look in his eyes. "Going somewhere," he yelled, lunging for me. I leaped, falling hard onto the ground below. Pain shot through my ankle, but I forced myself to ignore it as I scrambled to my feet and ran. The yard was dark, overgrown with weeds and twisted branches that seemed to reach for me. I didn't dare look back, knowing he was close behind. I raced through the darkness, my mind focused on escape. I spotted the streetlight up ahead, the warm glow of safety. I pushed my legs harder, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle, until I finally burst onto the sidewalk. I glanced back, heart pounding, to see Jason standing in the yard, silhouetted against the house, a predatory grin on his face. "Run all you want, but you can't hide," he called, his laughter echoing in the night. I sprinted toward the light, shouting for help, praying someone would hear me. As I reached the safety of the street, a car came around the corner, headlights illuminating the scene. I flagged it down, and the driver pulled over, eyes wide with confusion. "Get in." "Please," I cried, barely able to catch my breath. The driver didn't hesitate, opening the door wide. I jumped in, glancing back to see Jason standing there, watching me with a chilling calmness as the car sped away. My heart raced as I tried to comprehend what had just happened, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. As we drove into the night, I stole one last glance back at the house, its dark silhouette fading into the distance like a ghostly apparition. The oppressive atmosphere that had cloaked it moments before seemed to cling to the shadows, and I could almost feel Jason's twisted grin seared into my memory. The experience was a chilling lesson in trust and caution, a reminder that sometimes the masks people wear can conceal horrors far beyond our imagination. The excitement of costumes and candy had morphed into the fear of the unknown, and the echoes of Jason's maniacal laughter haunted me. I clenched my hands tightly in my lap, feeling the adrenaline still coursing through my veins as I tried to process what had just happened. That night, I learned that while some masks may be playful and fun, others hide darker intentions, and I vowed to never let my guard down again. It was Halloween night, one of those nights where the streets were alive with children and adults alike, decked out in their costumes, the distant sounds of laughter and shouting carrying through the air. I had just finished dinner at a friend's place, and despite the festive atmosphere, I was ready to call it a night. My walk home was a familiar one, a route I had taken countless times. It wasn't too far, maybe a mile and a half. The streets were littered with glowing jack-o' lanterns and hastily made decorations, flickering in the dim glow of porch lights. The occasional trick-or-treater passed by, but the hour was growing late, and most of the houses had already gone dark. I wasn't in a hurry. In fact, I liked walking alone at night. There was something calming about it, an opportunity to breathe, to let the stress of the day fall away. It was like a reset button. The streets, so full of noise and people during the day, turned into a quiet sanctuary after dark, especially on nights like tonight, when the festive chaos of Halloween had just begun to die down. The neighborhood was finally beginning to settle. The last few costumed kids had made their rounds, and most houses had turned off their porch lights, signaling that trick-or-treating was over. But tonight felt different. There was a sharp bite in the air, colder than usual for this time of year. The usual calm didn't sit right. It wasn't just the cold, there was something else, a kind of pressure in the atmosphere, like the world was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the typical Halloween mood. People get jumpy this time of year. You see shadows where there are none, hear noises that don't exist. It was part of the fun, right? As I walked, the decorations lining the streets became more extravagant. It seemed like every other house had tried to outdo the last. One in particular caught my eye. It was decked out in over-the-top Halloween-geared giant skeletons towered over the lawn, their hollow eyes glowing in eerie green fog machines pumped out a steady stream of mist, making the whole scene look like a haunted graveyard. Fake tombstones were scattered across the yard with corny messages like R.I.P. Bill's Diet and Here Lies a Cat Person. There was a speaker playing some scratchy recording of creepy laughter that echoed down the block. I chuckled to myself as I passed. People always go a bit overboard on Halloween. I admired their commitment, though. It made the night feel special, more alive. But as my eyes scanned the yard, something else caught my attention. Across the street, standing just at the edge of the sidewalk, was a figure. He, or at least I thought it was a he, was wearing a Halloween mask, one of those cheap plastic ones you can pick up at any store, with exaggerated, cartoonish features and a grotesque, almost too wide grin. His body was draped in a long, dark coat that seemed to swallow him whole, giving him an unnaturally tall and lanky appearance. The mask's painted-on smile gleamed under the streetlight, frozen in place, but somehow unsettling. I paused for a moment, trying to figure out if this was part of the house's elaborate decorations. But no, the figure was on the wrong side of the street, far from the lawn display. He was standing completely still, just staring. I couldn't see his eyes through the mask's narrow slits, but it felt like he was looking straight at me. I waved awkwardly, trying to break the tension, though I wasn't sure why I felt any tension at all. After all, it was Halloween. People were out and about wearing all kinds of strange costumes. Whoever this was, they were probably just having a little fun, messing with the stragglers who were still out. I shrugged, chuckled to myself, and kept walking. But after a few steps, I glanced back over my shoulder. The figure was still there. Only now, he was moving. Not quickly, not like he was running to catch up, but with a slow, deliberate pace. Just walking. Each step measured, purposeful. I couldn't hear his footsteps over the sound of my own, but I could feel him, that feeling of being watched, followed. My heart rate picked up a little, though I tried to brush it off, It's Halloween, I told myself again. Probably just some kid or a guy messing around, looking to scare someone before calling it a night. I turned onto my street, hoping that maybe when I reached my house he would peel off, maybe reveal himself as a friend playing a joke. But as I glanced back again, the man in the mask was still there. His silence was unnerving. No whoops, no shouting boo like some neighborhood kid trying to scare me. Just silent, unrelenting following. I picked up my pace, hoping to put some distance between us, but he matched me step for step. Every time I quickened, he quickened too. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, even though I couldn't see his eyes behind that grotesque grin on the mask. By the time I reached my house, my heart was pounding in my chest. I rushed up the steps to the porch, fumbling with my keys as I tried to get the door open. I glanced back again, and there he was still standing there at the end of my driveway, unmoving, the dim streetlight casting long shadows behind him. I practically threw myself into the house, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with shaky hands. I stood there, back pressed against the door, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was just a prank, just some Halloween scare tactic, but it didn't feel like a prank anymore. After a few moments, I slowly made my way to the front window, peeking through the blinds. He was still there, standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at my house. His posture hadn't changed. The mask's grin seemed even more twisted now under the dim light, mocking me, taunting me, taunting me. I backed away from the window, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? Who was this guy? Part of me wanted to fling the door open and confront him, but another part, the smarter part, kept me rooted in place. Something about him felt wrong. Not just a prank, not just a Halloween stunt. There was something sinister in the way he moved, the way he followed me without a word, without hesitation. I tried to distract myself, pacing around the living room, turning on the TV, anything to drown out the thoughts racing through my head. But every few minutes, I couldn't help but check the window again. And every time, he was still there. He wasn't leaving. Hours passed. It was well past midnight now, and the streets outside were dead silent. Not even a car passed by. I couldn't believe it, he was still standing there, still waiting. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but then I hesitated. What would I say? Some guy in a Halloween mask won't stop standing outside my house. It sounded ridiculous, like something out of a bad horror movie. I decided to wait it out. Surely he would get bored and leave eventually, right? But he didn't. I stayed awake for as long as I could, my eyes flicking between the TV and the window. Every time I checked, he was still there, never moving. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off on the couch. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, and for a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream. I jumped up and ran to the window, pulling back the curtain. He was gone. Gone. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. Maybe it had been some stupid prank after all, some creepy Halloween thing that had gotten under my skin. I laughed at myself for overreacting, for letting my imagination run wild. But as I was about to turn away from the window, something caught my eye, something on the porch. My breath hitched in my throat as I slowly opened the front door and stepped outside. Lying there, perfectly placed in the center of my porch, was the mask. The same grotesque mask the man had been wearing all night. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my mind scrambling for explanations. How could it be here? I hadn't heard him come up to the house. I hadn't heard anything. With trembling hands, I picked it up, my stomach churning. As I turned it over, a piece of paper fluttered to the ground, tucked inside the mask. I bent down to pick it up, unfolding the small scrap of paper. Scrawled in messy, jagged handwriting were 4 words that sent a chill down my spine. "I'll be back tonight." I dropped the mask and the note, stumbling backward into the house, slamming the door shut behind me once more. This time, I didn't just lock it, I bolted it, barricaded it, and double-checked every window and door in the house. I sat there in the silence, heart pounding, knowing that night would come again soon, and that he would be waiting. But this time, I had no idea what would happen next. Halloween had never been my favorite time of year. I didn't hate it, but something about the night just felt off. Sure, I'd dress up as a kid, join in the trick or treating with friends, but as I grew older, the novelty faded. I didn't get the thrill of pretending to be something else, of immersing yourself in the macabre for a night. The costumes, the masks, the cheap scares, it wasn't my thing. So when I got an unexpected call a few days before Halloween, inviting me to a party, I was hesitant. The call came from Tom, an old acquaintance from college I hadn't heard from in years. We were never particularly close, but I remembered him as a decent enough guy. He explained that he was throwing a small get-together at his new place in Old Mansion, he claimed, on the outskirts of town. He had bought it recently and had been restoring it ever since. Come on, man. It's going to be a blast. Just a few of us, nothing crazy. I promise you'll have a good time, he said, his voice filled with enthusiasm. I almost said no, but after thinking about it, I figured, why not? My life had been pretty monotonous lately, and it might be nice to get out for a night, have a few drinks, catch up with some old friends. Plus, how often do you get invited to a party in a mansion? The night of the party, I drove out to the address Tom had given me. It was further than I expected, well outside the city limits. The roads were dark, winding, the kind of place where streetlights were sparse, and you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you without your headlights. The trees were thick on either side of the road, their twisted branches looming overhead like skeletal fingers. Finally, I pulled up to the mansion. Even in the dim light of my car's headlights, I could tell it was old, really old. It towered over the grounds, its cracked stone walls covered in vines and ivy, windows tall and narrow, many of them broken or boarded up. The place had clearly seen better days. I parked the car and got out, feeling a strange chill in the air. The house had a presence about it, like it was watching me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I shook it off. It was just an old house, nothing more. The driveway was long and winding, and as I approached the front steps, I noticed something strange, no sound. No music, no voices, no sign of the party I had been expecting. I checked my phone to make sure I had the right time and place. Sure enough, Tom had texted me earlier, 9 p.m. at the mansion. Don't be late. It was just after 9, and yet nothing. The house loomed in front of me, its dark windows like eyes staring blankly into the night. I knocked on the front door, half expecting it to swing open on its own like something out of a horror movie. But nothing happened. As I knocked again, harder this time. The sound echoed off the old wooden door, but still no response. Then, just as I was about to give up and head back to my car, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom. Hey man, sorry, we're all inside. Doors open. Just come on in. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the house was dimly lit, the air thick with dust and the smell of something old, decaying. The place looked even more run down on the inside. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floors were covered in a thick layer of grime. Sheets covered most of the furniture, giving the place an eerie, abandoned feel. Tom, I called out, my voice echoing through the empty hallways. No answer. I walked further inside, my footsteps loud on the creaky wooden floors. I reached what looked like the living room. A large chandelier hung from the ceiling, though many of its bulbs had burned out, leaving the room bathed in a faint, sickly yellow glow. The furniture, covered in white sheets, looked like ghosts sitting in a circle around the cold, unused fireplace. There was something unsettling about the scene, like I had walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see. I took out my phone and texted Tom again. "Where are you guys? This place is creepy as hell." A few moments later, my phone buzzed with a reply. "We're upstairs. Just come up to the second floor. Last room on the right. Upstairs." I glanced toward the staircase at the far end of the room. It spiraled upward into darkness, the old wooden steps looking like they could collapse at any moment. I didn't want to go up there. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to get out of that house. But I had already come this far. It was just a party. Tom and the others were probably setting up some elaborate Halloween prank. I'd walk upstairs, they'd jump out in their costumes, and we'd all have a laugh about it over drinks. At least, that's what I told myself. I made my way to the staircase, each step groaning loudly under my weight. The air grew colder as I ascended, and the darkness seemed to thicken around me. By the time I reached the top, I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The dim glow illuminating the narrow hallway that stretched out before me. Old portraits lined the walls, faded, grim-looking figures staring down with eyes that seemed to follow me as I walked past. The floor creaked with every step, the sound echoing unnervingly in the empty space. I stopped in front of the last door on the right. It was slightly ajar, and from the other side I could hear a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a slow, rhythmic creaking, like something rocking back and forth. My hand hovered over the doorknob, a knot tightening in my stomach. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty. Well, almost empty. In the far corner, bathed in the faint light from the hallway, sat an old rocking chair. It swayed gently back and forth, creaking with each movement, though there was no one in it. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and I felt a deep sense of dread wash over me. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I spun around, heart racing, and grabbed the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. My phone buzzed in my hand. I glanced down at the screen, half expecting another text from Tom. But this time, the message was different. "You shouldn't have come." My blood ran cold. I tried the doorknob again, harder this time, but it still wouldn't move. Panic surged through me, and I began pounding on the door, shouting for help. "Tom. Anyone. Let me out." There was no response. Just the soft creaking of the rocking chair behind me. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The chair had stopped moving. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I backed away from the door, my phone's weak light barely cutting through the darkness. My mind was racing. Was this all part of the prank? Was Tom messing with me? But why would he lock me in here? My phone buzzed again. It's too late. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The shuffling outside the door grew louder, closer. My mind was screaming at me to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead. Suddenly, the door burst open. I didn't stop to see what or who had opened it. I bolted from the room, sprinting down the hallway, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me now, faster, heavier, pounding against the floor as they chased me. I reached the staircase and practically flew down the steps, nearly tripping over my own feet in my desperation to escape. The house felt alive, like it was closing in on me, suffocating me. I didn't stop running until I reached the front door. I yanked it open and stumbled outside, gasping for air. The cold night air hit my face, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But something made me glance back at the house one last time. There, in the second-story window, stood a figure. A dark silhouette, watching me. Its face was hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I ran to my car, jumped in, and sped away, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. It wasn't until I was miles away, back in the safety of my own apartment, that I dared to check my phone again. The conversation with Tom was gone, every message, every text erased. I called a mutual friend the next day, still shaken by what had happened. "Tom, you're talking about Tom Green?" my friend asked, confused. "He moved to Europe months ago. He's been gone for a while." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing. Whoever or whatever had invited me to that house, it hadn't been Tom. And whatever it was, it had been watching me. I remember that Halloween night vividly. It was the first time I felt truly afraid. I wasn't a little kid anymore. I was 15, almost 16. At that age, you're supposed to be too old for trick-or-treating, but young enough to enjoy the thrill of a good scare. I thought I was done being scared by monsters and ghosts. But that night, something changed. It started like any other Halloween. The streets were alive with kids dressed as ghouls, witches, and superheroes. Pumpkins flickered on porches, casting faint shadows across lawns. The air smelled of leaves and cold, and the occasional blast of cold wind made the night feel sharper. But I wasn't out there with the other kids, not this time. I was home, waiting for my parents to come back from some Halloween party. They had left me alone, trusting me to watch the house. After all, I was practically an adult, right? I sat on the couch, flipping through channels. The house was quiet, except for the occasional muffled laughter of trick-or-treaters from outside. The wind howled now and then, rattling the windows, but I told myself it was just a typical October night. Still, there was an unease in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started when I got home from school. Every time I looked out the window, it seemed like something or someone was just out of sight. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing. I chalked it up to Halloween jitters. Everyone gets paranoid on a night like this. At around 9 p.m., the trick-or-treaters thinned out. The street got quieter. I could hear the leaves rustling outside, the faint hum of streetlights buzzing in the distance. The house seemed to settle into the silence, and I felt strangely uneasy about it. I hadn't heard a knock on the door for a while, and the silence felt oppressive, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Then, around 10 p.m., it happened. I was sitting on the couch when I noticed a shadow in the hallway. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The hallway was dark, lit only by the glow of the TV, and shadows tend to play tricks on your mind. But this wasn't like the usual flicker of light and dark. The shadow was tall, human-like, standing at the end of the hall, just outside my bedroom door. I froze, staring at it, trying to figure out if my eyes were messing with me. But no matter how hard I blinked, it didn't disappear. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, unmoving, like it was watching me. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light maybe. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I couldn't bring myself to look away. It felt like if I blinked, it would move closer. My body was stiff, every muscle tense. I tried to rationalize it, maybe it was a coat hanging on the wall, or a shadow from the tree outside. But no, there was no tree that could cast a shadow like that inside the house, and the coat rack wasn't even near my room. I swallowed hard and stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to move. I had to prove to myself that it was nothing. I approached the hallway, slowly, my eyes never leaving the shadow. As I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The shadow wasn't cast on the wall, it was standing in the middle of the hallway, solid and dark, like a person. But it wasn't a person. It couldn't be. I stopped a few feet away, my heart racing, and then, without warning, the shadow shifted. Not much, just a small, subtle movement. Like it was leaning forward, waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The shadow didn't move again. It just stood there, silent and still. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the couch, too far away to grab without taking my eyes off the shadow. But I couldn't just stand there forever. I had to do something. I took a step back, then another. The shadow didn't follow me, but it didn't fade either. It just stood there, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the front door, my heart hammering in my chest. I yanked it open and stumbled outside, breathing hard. The street was empty. The laughter and footsteps of trick-or-treaters had vanished. The wind had died down and everything was eerily still. I stood on the porch trying to catch my breath, but the silence was almost worse than the shadow. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay outside forever, but going back inside felt like a death sentence. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to go back in. I couldn't just leave the house. My parents would be home soon, and I needed to figure out what the hell was going on. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe I was overreacting. I stepped back inside and closed the door, my eyes immediately darting to the hallway. The shadow was gone. Relief washed over me, but it didn't last long. Something was still off. The air in the house felt heavier, colder. I could feel it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I went back to the couch and grabbed my phone. I was going to call my parents, tell them to come home. But as soon as I unlocked my phone, the screen went black. I tried turning it on again, but nothing happened. It was dead. No warning, no low battery, just dead. That's when I heard it. A soft creaking noise coming from the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I turned slowly, my body trembling, and there it was again. The shadow. But this time, it was closer. Standing right at the edge of the living room, barely a few feet away from me. I backed up, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, waiting. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation, but there wasn't one. This wasn't normal. This wasn't a trick of the light. And then, without any warning, the shadow shifted again. Slowly, deliberately, it moved toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table and crashing to the floor. I scrambled to get up, my heart pounding in my chest, but the shadow kept coming. Closer. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was watch as the shadow loomed over me, dark and cold, like it was going to swallow me whole. And then, just as it was about to reach me, it stopped. For a moment, everything was still, silent. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The shadow lingered for a few agonizing seconds, and then, slowly, it began to fade. Bit by bit, it dissolved into the darkness, until there was nothing left. I sat there, trembling, my body drenched in sweat. Every inch of me felt paralyzed, my muscles locked in a state of terror. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, too terrified that the shadow would reappear, that it would come back and finish whatever it had started. My heart was still pounding in my chest and my skin was cold, clammy. The silence around me became a heavy blanket, smothering me. I strained my ears for any sound, any hint that the shadow might still be there, lurking just beyond my sight. But there was nothing, just the faint creak of the house settling and the distant wind whispering through the trees outside. When my parents finally came home later that night, I was still sitting there, staring at the hallway where the shadow had been. I heard their car pull into the driveway, their keys jangling as they unlocked the door. Relief washed over me, but I couldn't shake the lingering dread. They came in, laughing and talking about their party, completely oblivious to what had happened. I wanted to tell them, to spill everything right then and there. But how could I? How could I explain that I'd been paralyzed by fear, that a shadow had nearly suffocated me with its presence? They'd think I was crazy. They'd brush it off as a Halloween scare, a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild after watching too many horror movies. So I stayed quiet. I kept it all to myself. My parents asked if I was okay, and I just nodded, forcing a weak smile. I told them everything was fine, that I had a headache and was just tired. They believed me, of course. Why wouldn't they? But I knew the truth. And even now, all these years later, I can still feel it. Every Halloween, when the air turns cold and the night grows thick with shadows, I can feel that presence again, watching me, waiting. I don't see it anymore, not like I did that night, but I know it's there. I've never been the kind of person to scare easily. I pride myself on being logical and practical. Fear wasn't something I thought about much, not until that Halloween night. The air was crisp and electric with the thrill of the season, the scent of damp leaves mingling with the faint whiff of pumpkin spice wafting through the neighborhood. I had just finished dinner, a simple pasta dish that I barely remembered tasting, and settled down in front of the TV. I flipped through the channels aimlessly, eventually landing on a crime documentary. It was one of those shows where the narrator's calm voice tells you horrifying stories, making them sound mundane, like reading the news. This one was about home invasions. I wasn't paying much attention at first, but then something caught my ear, a description of how easily burglars slip into homes unnoticed, how they bypass locks, enter through windows, and terrorize unsuspecting families. There were stories of people waking up to find strangers in their bedrooms or discovering that someone had been living in their attic for days without them knowing. I shook my head and laughed. That would never happen to me. I always double-checked my doors before bed, made sure the windows were locked, and had motion sensor lights outside. My house was a fortress, or at least it felt like one. The show ended, and I switched off the TV, feeling a little smug in my security routine as I locked the front door. It was late, probably around midnight, and I wasn't particularly tired, but I headed to bed anyway. I figured I could scroll through my phone for a bit until I drifted off to sleep. After brushing my teeth, I climbed into bed, turning off the bedside lamp. The room sank into darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside, filtering through the curtains. I lay there for a while, my mind wandering over the usual thoughts: work, bills, mundane things. But then I heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible thump. I froze. It was faint, but it was there. At first, I thought it might have been the house settling. Old houses make noises, creaks and groans that you eventually get used to. But this was different. It wasn't the usual creaking of floorboards or the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. This was deliberate, like a footstep. My ears strained in the silence, trying to catch any sound. For a moment, there was nothing, just the heavy stillness of the night. I let out a slow breath, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then it happened again, a thud, closer this time. My heart began to race, my body instinctively tensing. I wasn't alone. I sat up slowly, every nerve in my body on edge. The room was dark, the shadows thick and heavy. My phone was on the nightstand, and I reached for it, but my hand hesitated. What was I going to do? Call the police and tell them I heard a noise? It could be nothing. But the sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate footstep, just outside my bedroom door. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. My house wasn't big. There was no way anyone could be inside without me noticing, unless they had been in here before I went to bed. My mind raced, running through every possible scenario. Maybe someone had slipped in while I was distracted. Maybe they had been waiting, watching me all night. I forced myself to move, creeping out of bed as quietly as I could. My bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor, and I tiptoed across the room, pressing my ear to the door. There it was, breathing, soft, shallow, and deliberate. My own breath caught in my throat. Someone was on the other side of the door. I backed away, heart pounding. My hand clutched my phone so tightly my knuckles ached as I dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, but I kept my voice low, whispering into the phone as I explained the situation. "There's someone in my house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're outside my bedroom door." The operator's calm voice was almost surreal. "Stay where you are, sir. Officers are on their way." I glanced at the door. "How long?" "Just a few minutes," she replied. I didn't have a few minutes. The door handle began to turn. I stared, my blood running cold as the knob rotated slowly, silently. The door creaked open, just a sliver at first, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, tall and still, almost blending into the darkness. I couldn't make out his face, but the glint of metal in his hand told me all I needed to know. A knife. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to do something, run, hide, fight, but I was frozen. The figure just stood there, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rhythm. He didn't rush me. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, waiting, like he was savoring the moment. I finally found my voice. What? The figure tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, but didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward. That was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp from the nightstand, and hurled it at him. It wasn't much, but it was the only thing I could think of. The lamp hit him square in the chest with a dull thud, and he staggered back, but he didn't fall. Then, he laughed. A low, raspy chuckle that sent a wave of terror through me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I bolted out of the bedroom, sprinting down the hallway toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear his footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unhurried, like he knew I couldn't escape. My hands fumbled with the lock, my fingers trembling as I tried to get the door open. I could feel him getting closer. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Finally, the lock clicked, and I flung the door open, practically throwing myself outside into the cold night air. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. My feet pounded the pavement as I ran down the street, not stopping until I saw the flashing lights of a police car in the distance. Relief washed over me as the car pulled up, and 2 officers jumped out, their guns drawn. I pointed frantically toward the house, my chest heaving as I tried to explain what had happened. "He's inside," I gasped. "He's in the house." The officers didn't hesitate. They rushed inside while I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. Every nerve in my body was still on high alert, and the cold night air felt sharp against my skin, but I couldn't think straight. My mind was stuck on the image of that man, his grin, the malicious glint in his eyes. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen in that moment, replaying it over and over, wondering how close I had come to real danger. Minutes passed. I paced in the yard, trying to breathe, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was still racing, but the initial surge of adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me cold and shaky. I rubbed my arms, glancing at the officers as they moved from room to room inside my house, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. I half expected to hear shouts, or the clattering sound of someone being caught, but nothing came, only silence. Finally, the front door creaked open, and one of the officers stepped out, his expression tight. He looked at me, then at his partner, as if he didn't quite know how to break the news. "There's no one in there," he said slowly, shaking his head. "We searched the whole house. It's empty." I blinked, my brain refusing to comprehend his words. What I stammered, "No, that's impossible. I saw him. He was in my kitchen. He chased me. I saw him." The officers exchanged glances, clearly thinking I was hysterical. The look in their eyes said it all. They didn't believe me. but I knew what I saw. That man had been inside my house. I could still feel his presence, like a lingering poison in the air. I stood frozen in my room, paralyzed by fear as slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the hallway outside my door, confirming my worst nightmare. He was still here, lurking in the shadows, taunting me with his presence. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but before I could dial, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. The air felt electric, charged with impending danger, and I was acutely aware that I wasn't just being watched, I was being hunted.